Hello and welcome to the presentation on recovery and fatigue management strategies for endurance athletes. If you are an endurance athlete or you are a coach who works with endurance athletes, I hope this presentation will help you understand recovery and fatigue management strategies for your athletes. My name is Matt Casturo. I am a doctor of physical therapy and certified strength and conditioning specialist. You guys may know me from YouTube or Instagram as The Movement System. Most of the content that I put out is around strength and conditioning for movement science professionals, as well as endurance training. I'm a triathlete myself, which you'll see as part of this presentation. So I wanted to start off with this quote from Eric Cressey: "The best recovery solution is to never develop a work capacity problem in the first place." So a lot of this presentation will be based around how do we actually do effective workload management so that way we don't run into problems where we need a lot of recovery strategies. We will still talk about more traditional recovery strategies, but the focus will be on workload management, effective program design for endurance athletes, and tapering for competition to manage training fatigue. Specifically, we're going to start off by talking about how do we plan a training year or a macro cycle. If we have a good macro cycle planning right off the bat, that'll really help us with fatigue management because we're not going to be overtraining if we have a good structure to our training year. Then we're going to look at tapering for competition because this is a specific fatigue management strategy. If we can do an effective taper leading to our main races or our main competitions as endurance athletes, we can actually put our best performance out on race day. And I'm actually going to show you an example from my Ironman 70.3 taper that you guys can specifically see how this is implemented. Lastly, we'll talk about postseason and off-season training. So what do we do for recovery and fatigue management in the postseason and the off-season training period? So to get started, this is an example macro cycle that I laid out for one of my online training clients at one point. And what you can see here is that the main A race was in August. And this is a pretty typical triathlon training season where we train throughout the summer. And towards the end of summer, maybe August or September, we have our main race. From an aerobic training perspective, what you can see is most of the year is spent here in this base training phase. And then as we build up towards competition, we have a build phase where we're going to build intensity, and then a taper and a peak phase. This is just generally what our training year is going to look like. This isn't sets and reps. That's going to be done at more of the microcycle or the mesocycle level, but this would be the overall training structure for the entire year. I like to throw in my goals from a aerobic training perspective as well as a strength training perspective here on what we're going to be focusing on in different parts of the year. Generally, as we approach the season and as we approach our race, we're going to do more power work or strength work, which is low volume. And then generally speaking, this is going to allow us to taper off our strength so that maybe even leading up to our A race, we're doing active rest or maybe just once a week, pretty minimal weightlifting, and we're really dialing in sport-specific endurance training. Off season or post season, you may see a heavier focus on strength training. Maybe for two or 3 months in the off season, we're doing really focused strength-specific work for our endurance athletes with their base phase. In terms of this presentation, we're going to focus on this section here of the macro cycle where we're tapering, we're peaking, and then we're doing some postseason or off-season work. All right, so one principle of workload management here that we want to go ahead and cover right away is acute to chronic workload ratio. So acute to chronic workload ratio is a general principle that if we are drastically changing our training load and our training volume, that would increase injury risk. This applies to endurance athletes, strength athletes, and any other athletes who are doing even power and plyometric training or speed training or really anything. If we are doing 1.0, that would mean that we're doing the same training today as we're chronically adapted to. So if we have an endurance athlete who's chronically adapted to doing 3 hours of cycling a week, and this week they're doing 3 hours, that would be a 1-to-1 acute to chronic workload ratio. And obviously, because they're adapted to doing this for a long period of time, they're not going to increase their injury risk here. But that said, we still want to be able to progress them. So we probably want to go above 1.0, especially as we're approaching the season and we're adding training volume here. So for example, we might do 1.1 or 1.3 so that if they're used to doing 3 hours of training, we might add 10 to 30%. 30% is really the general cutoff here for about how much we would want to add at one period of time. The rule of thumb would be to add 5 to 10% training volume per week in a phase of training when we're increasing volume, and then to go no more than 30%. As you can see here, a 2.0 would be like if you were doubling. So we went from doing 3 hours a week, and then we just jumped right up to doing 6 hours a week of cycling. Now that would be a 2.0 or double acute to chronic workload ratio and would significantly increase risk of injury. Similarly, if our triathlete was doing, or our runner or our other endurance athlete was doing, say, 80 reps of plyometric exercises, if you just jumped up and did 160 reps of different plyometric exercises immediately in the next workout, that would again be a 2 acute to chronic workload ratio and potentially risk injury. A better, more progressive program to reduce that risk of injury would be going from 80 reps to 85 reps to 90 reps to 95 reps over the course of a program. This would progressively overload them and reduce risk of injury just by good workload management. This principle applies again to all athletes, and we will see it come back up here over and over again. All right, so now let's get into heart rate zones. And heart rate zones are something that we can use either a 5-zone or a 3-zone model for. The main research that I used for this presentation, and what you'll see in the majority of the research, is this 5-zone model here, though you should be aware of that 3-zone model, which you may run into in the research. But using this 5-zone model, what we can see here is that zone 2, which I highlighted here, is 60 to 70% of max heart rate. Now, this is a zone that would be considered manageable. A lot of recreational endurance athletes end up falling into threshold training because it feels hard. So this zone 3 or threshold training is what would feel hard. Like if you go out and you just try to run pretty hard, you're probably going to end up in zone 3. Zone 3 is where a lot of people end up spending a lot of their volume, but based on the research, we should probably be shifting more of our training volume towards zone 2. I'm going to pull some quotes from different research articles here in a second, but the general principle here is that a large percentage of endurance training should be spent in zone 2. An example of a training protocol that would include a large percentage of zone 2 work would be something like polarized training or pyramidal training. Polarized training just sounds like what it is. It's where we polarize our training, so we have a lot of zone 2 and then a lot of higher intensity zone 4 and 5 work, and we kind of avoid the middle zone more so. Pyramidal training has the majority of training in zone 2, but has some training in zone 3, some training in zone 4 and 5. Either of these protocols stand up pretty well in the literature. There's more research around polarized training, but I think both approaches are very effective and would beat the threshold approach in terms of how we should be coaching most of our athletes. From a meta-analysis that I have linked on this slide, and I do have all the research references at the end of this presentation as well, we can see that results suggest that polarized may lead to greater improvements in endurance sport performance than threshold. We know that our meta-analysis shows what the overall body of research is showing from some smaller studies. Some smaller studies like randomized controlled trials and whatnot may show us more specific conclusions, such as the following. Training intensity in zone 2 was related to better performance on a half Ironman race in recreational triathletes. So overall, I think the message here with looking at these heart rate zones is that the majority of our recreational athletes who are not tracking their heart rate and not strategic about their planning could benefit from a coach strategically shifting their training workloads to have more zone 2 training. Now, because you guys are probably wondering about recovery techniques as well, we're going to talk about those a little bit here. So once we have our workload dialed in and our training intensity distribution dialed in, we can think about things like nutrition, sleep, and other recovery strategies. In terms of evidence-based recovery training strategies, nutrition and sleep really are the big ones to give you the most bang for your buck here. If we can dial in good nutrition, most of our endurance athletes are going to benefit from good intra-workout carbohydrate intake, as well as consuming enough carbs, protein, and fat to maintain their body weight and fuel training. And there's a ton of evidence out there that sleeping for closer to 8 or 9 hours is significantly better for performance than sleeping 6 or less hours. In terms of other traditional recovery techniques that you may have heard of, massage probably has the greatest positive effect for your athletes. This is pretty consistent across the literature. We can get a similar effect from things like compression boots, cold exposure, and cryotherapy as well. So depending on if your athlete is kind of dialed in on their training enough and they want to explore some of these recovery techniques, these are some to consider. Compression boots, cold exposure, cryotherapy, massage, and then there's mixed evidence around foam rolling. This probably doesn't need to be a ton of foam rolling and doesn't need to be a ton of pressure to see some benefit from this, but we may not get as much benefit as some of the techniques above. Okay, so now let's shift towards talking about tapering for competition. So what is a taper? A taper is a period of reduced training load in lead up to a major competition. The goal of a taper is to reduce training fatigue without losing training adaptations. So tapering is really huge leading up to competition and can significantly improve performance. A well-designed taper will have an athlete feeling fresh and ready to go to hit their race day hard with good intensity and not feeling like they have heavy legs or like they're burnt out from training. That said, there's a lot of misinformation out there about tapering and not so evidence-based strategies. So we're going to talk about what the actual research says on tapering and try to clear this up. If you start looking into the research about tapering for endurance athletes, you'll see a ton of information from a researcher, Inigo Mujica. Inigo Mujica is a great researcher who's been doing a ton of research on endurance athletes and tapering. And what we could see from some of his research here is that we typically want to decrease training volume and maintain or slightly increase intensity. This is something that a lot of coaches and a lot of endurance athletes mess up. They get closer to competition and they want to just go easier with their sessions. The problem is that if we decrease our intensity, that's not necessarily going to reduce fatigue. It's really the volume that we want to start decreasing and maintain or even slightly increase our intensity. If we think about the heart rate zones, zone 2 is really great for driving those aerobic adaptations, but it's not where we're going to compete. We're going to compete with a higher heart rate in zone 3 or zone 4 even. And that's where we're going to want to drive those specific adaptations as we approach the race. So you may want to shift some of your zone 2 rides towards more threshold rides. If you were, for example, doing a 3-hour cycling ride at zone 2, you may shift that to an 1.5-hour ride with more threshold training. So 20 to 30 minute intervals at your race pace, for example. This will dial in those race specific adaptations. And because you're accommodated to this larger volume of training, whenever you decrease that to 40 to 60% roughly of your training volume that you're accommodated to, you're not going to experience a lot of fatigue from that training. So this approach where we decrease volume 41 to 60%, we maintain our frequency, and we maintain or slightly increase our intensity will really drive those specific adaptations to get our athletes feeling fresh and ready to go on race day. I had to screenshot this research article because I think the title says it all. Intense training, the key to optimal performance before and during a taper. So do not make the mistake of decreasing your intensity as you lead up to a competition because it really won't set your athletes up for the best success. Instead, again, we want to turn down that volume and then really dial in that race-specific intensity. The goal is to reduce fatigue and increase fitness, especially sport-specific fitness. The neuromuscular system really likes tapers. It really benefits from reducing that fatigue and maintaining or increasing that sport-specific fitness. Especially for endurance training, fatigue dissipates more quickly than fitness is lost. The principle here is about residual adaptations. So strength adaptations, for example, are slightly less residual than aerobic adaptations. Whenever I say residual, it means it lasts a really long time. So aerobic adaptations to your heart and to your mitochondria and to your enzymes tend to last a really long time, even with lower training volumes, meaning that you can reduce your training volume to reduce fatigue, but you'll still maintain the fitness adaptations that you've had for a longer time, even with reduced training volume. Aerobic adaptations are some of the most residual training adaptations. Adaptations like power and neuromuscular strength gains are less residual, meaning they turn over faster or they're more transient. we lose them if we don't train them frequently, which is why we'll talk about in a second here. Your strength taper for strength sports is going to be significantly shorter than a taper for endurance performance. The overall message here, though, is to increase that sport specificity, decrease your volume. So we're using those race pace specific efforts, tempo runs, tempo training as we approach competition. I do want to mention before I forget, if you guys do have any questions as I go through this presentation, don't hesitate to send me a message on Instagram at The Movement System, and I'd be happy to shoot you a message back or help point you in the right direction for the information. Okay, so how long before competition should we reduce training load? Typically, a 2-week taper seems to provide optimal results for endurance athletes. This is according to a meta-analysis, but you will want to individualize to your athlete. If you have a professional athlete or a high-level athlete who's been training consistently for a long time, that 2-week taper is going to be really important. If you have more of an age group competitor who's kind of more of a recreational athlete and trains off and on, this taper may not need to be a full 2 weeks. They actually may need only a 1-week taper or even less because they haven't been consistent enough to actually build up a lot of training fatigue. So we do want to consider the individuality of this recommendation. For strength athletes, if we're thinking about a power lifter tapering for their powerlifting competition, for example, entirely different recommendation, and we don't want to get that confused. We're often seeing a 2 to 6 day taper optimal for strength athletes because, again, their adaptations are less residual. That said, the principle is still the same. We're still getting more sport specific to their competition specific lifts, and we're going to decrease their training volume as they approach that competition, practicing more singles and doubles and more competition specific movements, for example. If you have a field sport athlete or someone who's mixed, who has some strength, some aerobic training going on, you may need to mix your protocol and figure out what's best in that individual situation. Okay, another question that I feel like a lot of people aren't giving great advice on: do longer events require longer tapers? The evidence here actually says no. It's more about the individual athlete than it is the duration of the event. We probably don't need to see, for example, a really long taper for a full Ironman 8, 9, 10-hour race and a short taper for an Olympic triathlon, because really the residual training effects and a lot of the fatigue dissipation science is going to be about the same regardless. The athlete would benefit from the same recommendations of 41 to 60% reduction in training volume and about a 2-week taper, regardless of the length of that competition. This might vary if it's a B race or if they have multiple events throughout the year, for example. We might not do as long of a taper. We might do a short taper just because it's not as important of an event and we don't want to risk losing fitness adaptations. We might kind of train through that race, for example. But specifically based on the length of the event alone, we don't need a longer or shorter taper, according to the evidence. And again, I do have the research references linked at the end of the presentation. All right, now let's take a look at the actual training protocol that I used for my half Ironman 70.3 Arizona here to hit a huge PR. I was working with a coach, Chris Johnson, the PT, so I do want to give him a shout out here. So if you guys aren't already, make sure you go ahead and follow Chris Johnson, the PT, on Instagram. Really great for information and coaching. So what you can see here is that on the left, this is my training protocol for 3 weeks pre-race. So this is before the taper, pretty intense, higher volume training. And then this next on the right here, you can see is race week. So what you can see here is that roughly everything is about double here, 3 weeks out compared to the week of competition. So I was cycling about 7 hours 3 weeks before, and then in the week leading up to competition, it was closer to 3 hours. Running was about 2.5 hours the week 3 weeks before, and that was down to about 2 hours the week of competition. Swimming about 2 hours 3 weeks before, down to about 1 hour pre-competition. So as you can see, the taper was roughly 50% volume reduction, and really the intensity was the same or slightly higher. I was trying to hit more race-specific efforts here as I approached competition, whereas a lot more of this zone 2 work and lower intensity, higher volume work we would see over here 3 weeks prior. Okay, moving on to our postseason. So hopefully at this point, we've tapered our athlete for competition. We had good workload management to keep them away from injuries throughout their training year. And they got to their race and they hit a PR. And now it's postseason and we have to consider what to do now. So this really comes down to coaching strategy. And the coaching strategy here could be about 2 to 4 weeks of non-sport specific training for our year-round competitive athletes who are doing year-round training. This might not be necessary if an athlete already has other breaks throughout the year or just less demanding training schedule in general. But for our athletes who are training year-round with specific movements, like our year-round runners whose bodies are taking a toll from doing all these races and a lot of running training, they may really benefit from 2 to 4 weeks of non-sport specific training in the postseason. This is a really good time to develop muscular balance and fully recover mentally and physically from the season. You should consider a 1 to 2 week ramp down period, because when we're talking about acute to chronic workload ratio, these athletes are adapted to doing, say, 6 hours a week of running if they're a runner, 7 hours, 8 hours a week of running maybe. And if we get to the end of the season and we just cut that right off to zero, that actually could increase injury risk from decreasing volume too dramatically. A ramp down period would involve doing a little bit of recovery runs and kind of reducing their training volume for a week or two after the season, followed by that 2 week or so postseason training period with no sport specific training, and then followed by a ramp back up to off-season training. This is just a principle of good workload management and not seeing too drastic of changes in these athletes' programs. Postseason and off-season are a really great time to incorporate strength training. This would be the time period where we would see the lowest interference effect with hard intervals and efforts. So for example, if we're leading up to competition and we have race-specific tempos and we have higher intensity interval training worked into the program, that might not be a good time to be adding a ton of strength work on top of that. Whereas by contrast, an athlete in the postseason or off-season who's taking a break from some of their sport-specific training and either they're just doing maintenance work or they're doing base training, which is more low intensity and steady state, that's a really good time to pair that type of aerobic training with good strength training. Now you can make the argument for using a polarized or pyramidal training approach or training intensity distribution for most of the off-season and even most of the preseason leading up to their competitive period. But it's particularly beneficial to have a large portion of this base work, this zone 2 work that we've been talking about in the off-season, because it builds them a base and it allows them to adapt to a high volume of training so that they can handle the loads and the intensity of in-season training when they get there. In terms of resistance training for endurance athletes and how much we should do, I pulled a couple quotes from Inigo Mujica, who you might remember is the researcher who contributed a lot of research to the tapering side of things. Some things that he said were, I would recommend heavy lifting and few repetitions. So he's talking about the strength zone here. We might be doing 3, 4, 5 sets of less than 6 reps typically here with heavy weight. We're specifically developing those neuromuscular adaptations for strength here. And also we're going to get a benefit to the endurance athletes' tendon health as well. Some tendon specific training that we could do for endurance athletes that is particularly beneficial for older endurance athlete is things like isometric exercises and strength training with heavy loads. We don't get a lot of benefit to tendon strength from doing muscular endurance work, but by doing less than 6 reps with really heavy loads, we will see a benefit to muscle strength and tendon strength. Another thing that Inigo says here is I would recommend doing 4 to 5 key exercises twice a week during the build-up phase and later during the competitive season once a week simply for maintenance. So he's not talking about the postseason and the offseason. He's specifically talking about the preseason leading up to the competitive period where he wants to do 4 to 5 key exercises, probably compound lifts that are providing the athlete the most bang for their buck during that build-up phase leading up to the competitive season. And then in season, as the athlete's doing a lot of hard competition-specific endurance training, that's whenever they're going to be maybe doing just once a week of strength training for maintenance. We don't want to add a ton of fatigue from strength training on top of intense endurance training fatigue. Off-season, that recommendation may be a bit more. Our endurance athletes could probably handle 2, 3, or 4 times a week of strength training, again, depending on their goals and what level they're at. And he also does mention the importance of plyometric work, saying, on top of this, I would also like to add some plyometric work. This can be really beneficial for endurance athletes to develop tendon strength, muscular coordination, and other benefits from plyometric exercises. Overall, for training endurance athletes, it really comes down to managing a lot of these different variables. As we're pushing their sport-specific endurance training, we're probably going to dial back a little bit on strength training. As they dial back on that endurance training, we're going to have time and room to kind of push a bit more in terms of strength and maybe plyometric work. Learning good workload management, understanding the science of these fatigue management and tapering strategies can really set you up for coaching endurance athletes at a high level and giving them really great results that they may not get by just training on their own. Getting a lot of these variables right can keep your endurance athletes away from injuries and get them performing at a very high level consistently year after year. If you guys enjoyed this presentation, you want to learn more, go ahead and follow the Movement System on YouTube, on Instagram. I also have the Movement System podcast where I teach a lot of these concepts, and I'm on TikTok as well at the Movement System. I'm happy to answer any of your questions or point you in the right direction towards information. So if you do have any follow-up questions to this presentation, don't hesitate to reach out. Here are the references from this presentation. I hope you guys learned a ton. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and enjoy the rest of the summit.